In the dead of night, under a sky littered with cold stars, the settler's gaze, fixed on the trembling form of the Apache warrior, collapsed near his homestead. Blood seeped from a jagged wound on the man's side, his breath shallow and ragged. Each labored inhale was a desperate plea, a fragile thread holding a life dangerously close to unraveling. The settler's hands hovered, torn between fear and an unyielding pull of mercy. Choosing to turn away would mean condemning a man who, by all codes, was his enemy. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. Around the isolated ranch, the vast plains stretched endlessly, an unforgiving canvas of parched earth and twisted sagebrush. The wind whispered through sparse grass, carrying the scent of dust and smoke from distant fires. A heavy silence wrapped the homestead, punctuated only by the faint crackling of embers in the settler's hearth. Shadows lengthened like silent sentinels, testing the fragile barrier between life and death on this forsaken edge of civilization. Inside his weathered cabin, the settler's mind wrestled with the impossible choice before him. Years of hardship carved lines deep into his face. Survival had taught him suspicion was a shield. Yet, there was something raw and vulnerable in the warrior's eyes, more than just an embodiment of an enemy. The man's chest rose and fell unevenly, the wound pulsing beneath tattered skin. The settler knew silence was vital. To offer aid could invite peril, neighbors' distrust, the wrath of the Apache tribe seeking one of their own, or worse, death looming on the horizon like a storm. Despite the pounding fear in his chest, compassion gnawed at him, the unspoken bond between two souls caught in. The merciless frontier began to stitch itself quietly. With trembling hands, he tore clean cloth, pressing it gently against the bloodied side. Each moment was a gamble, each heartbeat heavy with risk. The night held them suspended, a fragile truce forged not from words, but from the profound humanity that defied lines drawn in dust and blood. Yet the settler was painfully aware of the cost behind his mercy. Outside, under the veil of darkness, the land bred whispers of danger. Hidden eyes, loyal warriors bound by honor and fury, tracked the soft pulse of their fallen brother. Their presence was an unspoken threat. They would not rest until he was found. The settler's quiet refuge was a fragile island, surrounded by a rising tide of resolve and wrath. He guarded his secret with rigid resolve, knowing the delicate balance between sanctuary and destruction would shatter at the first break of dawn. Their first exchanges were silent, weighted with suspicion and exhaustion. The warrior's eyes flickered with guarded caution, his breaths shallow yet fierce with pride. The settler watched every subtle flicker of muscle, every hesitant motion, as if reading the language between wounds and survival. Trust was a thread stretched thin, vulnerable to even the slightest tremor. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of movement, the soft trampling of feet pressing closer to the homestead's edge. Every shadow felt heavier, the night suddenly colder. Then, as the eastern horizon faintly bled with the first light, a chilling stillness gripped the land. The settler turned slowly toward the sound that hadn't been there moments before. A dozen figures emerging with ghostly silence, encircling the homestead. The warriors stood statuesque, their eyes hard and unyielding, weapons poised, yet words unspoken. The delicate thread of mercy was now a rope pulling taut toward a reckoning none could escape. In that suffocating pause before dawn's full blaze, the settler faced the crushing truth. His act of compassion had summoned a storm. Not deliverance, but confrontation awaited. Would mercy be his salvation, or the harbinger of doom? Many fellow travelers who follow our legends across these forgotten lands have told us that fate, or the treacherous YouTube algorithm, sometimes cancels their subscriptions without warning. Before the next perilous trail unfolds and a new twist arrives, glance quickly below this video and make sure you're still enlisted with our band, so you don't lose the thread of the story. We don't want you to miss the voices echoing through this valley. Check your subscription now and join our saga. Dawn crept slowly up the horizon, casting a pale gray light over the tense tableau. The settler stood motionless, his breath caught in his throat as the dozen Apache warriors stepped from shadow to shadow, their gaze locked onto the battered figure cradled inside his cabin. Their silence was sharper than any rifle shot, reverberating through the thin walls and thickened air like a warning no man could afford to ignore. The wounded Apache's chest rose with a quiet struggle, each breath a fragile declaration of life. His eyes, flickering yet fierce, met the stare of the approaching warriors, reflecting both recognition and the unyielding pride of a people forged by harsh land and harder loss. The settler's grip tightened on the cloth, still pressed against the jagged wound, knowing this moment balanced precariously between salvation and ruin. A low murmur whispered. Among the encircling figures, words neither friend nor foe might fully comprehend, a language older than these plains, steeped in honor and retribution. The settler swallowed the lump growing in his throat and stepped forward, joining the threshold between life and death that fate had so cruelly drawn. Must he die? His voice rasped, raw from sleepless nights and heavy hope. The tallest warrior, his face marked with scars, tracing battles untold, nodded slowly, answering more with his eyes than his words. He carries the fire of our ancestors, but his time wanes. We seek only to honor his spirit. The settler's gaze flicked back to the wounded man, whose fading breaths stoked a desperate ember of defiance. Beneath the bruised flesh and bloodied skin lay a story etched in pain and sacrifice, one that tangled with the settler's own fractured past. Past he had buried beneath years of dust and silence. "You think I would betray my own blood," the settler whispered, voice heavy with blame he felt but could not voice aloud. "But I chose mercy, not because I am weak, but because there is more to justice than vengeance." A ghost of understanding flickered across the encircling warriors, as if the weight of that admission pressed upon their souls. Time stretched thin, a fragile thread threatening to snap. The smell of scorched wood from the dying fire mingled with the earthy scent of early morning dew, weaving a tapestry of tension and reverence. Suddenly, a sharp crack shattered the fragile stillness. A twig snapped beneath heavy boot. All eyes snapped toward the sound. From the south ridge came the pounding of hooves, dust spiraling into ghostly plumes against the stark landscape. The settler's heart pounded louder than the distant thunder, knowing who rode with death's shadow on their heels. "Rangers," he breathed, the word tasting of dread and inevitability. The Apache warriors stiffened, their silent vigil shattered by the approaching storm. Yet even as the danger closed, the settler found within himself a well of fierce resolve deeper than he imagined. He stepped back inside, voice steady, though his hands shook. "We will not surrender him. Not today. This man is under my roof, by my will." One warrior knelt beside the dying brother, his fingers brushing the bruised skin with a tenderness that jagged the settler's heart. "Then we stand with you," the man declared, voice low, carrying the gravity of an unspoken oath. The others closed ranks, the borders between enemies flickering like a candle in the wind. Fragile, yet alive. Minutes bled into hours as the first rays of sun pierced the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. Inside the cabin, the settler tore another strip of cloth, slowing the bleeding, fighting against time and waning hope. The wounded man's eyes fluttered weakly, and for a fleeting moment he reached out with trembling fingers, grasping the settler's wrist. A silent thank you wrapped in pain. Outside, the approaching rangers formed jagged silhouettes against the rising light. Their leader, a grizzled man with cold eyes and a slower, calculating gait, raised a weathered hand, signaling half a dozen riders to dismount. Their rifles were leveled toward the cabin, like iron fingers poised to crush, the air thick with promise of violence. Inside, the settler's breath caught. The fragile alliance between man and warrior trembled under the weight of this new threat. He glanced at the warriors who had sworn to stand by him, faces unreadable but resolute. The odds were unforgiving. Between the Rangers' impending siege and the Apache tribe's hunters circling in silence, survival seemed a thread thinner than the bloodied cloth in his hand. Yet beneath the crushing pressure, a spark of defiance burned. Mercy had not been weakness. It was a gamble on something bigger, on a fragile hope that between enemies, a sliver of humanity could take root. A sudden clatter to the side drew every eye. From the shadows, a figure burst forth, wild-eyed and ragged, a messenger dispatched by those lurking beyond. He gasped a single word that struck like a bullet. "They're coming, greater numbers, and they're dividing the land with fire." The settler's pulse thundered in his ears as the weight of that revelation crashed like a storm surge. This was no longer about one man's wound or a fragile truce formed in desperation. This was the spark that could ignite the plains themselves, and the thin line between survival and annihilation was about to shatter. His gaze met the Apache warriors once more, honor-bound sons of a land bleeding beneath its own fury. The settler swallowed hard, voice barely a whisper. "We have but one choice now: stand together or fall divided in the flames." Outside the cabin door, the Rangers tightened their grip on their weapons. Within the walls, the air grew heavy with unsaid vows and unyielding resolve. And as the morning light bled fully into the sky, there came the unmistakable scent of smoke, rising fast and wild, fire racing over the dry earth, carrying with it the promise of a reckoning no soul could outrun. Dawn bled softly into the shadows as the Apache warriors closed their silent circle around the homestead. The settlers' cabin stood like a fragile beacon amid the growing tension, its weathered walls trembling under the weight of unspoken threats. The wounded Apache, his breaths shallow and ragged, lay cradled in the settler's arms, a fragile lifeline amid a sea of impending danger. Outside, the earth held its breath. The distant drum of hooves grew louder, drawing nearer with every heartbeat. The leather of the settler's hands twitched against the coarse cloth pressed to the raw wound. His eyes darted past the circle of watchful warriors to the ridge where the first riders crested the hill, a line of rangers marked by cold steel and colder intent. Time seemed to warp between the ragged breaths and the creak of old wood. The tallest warrior, whose scarred face spoke of battles long past, stepped forward. His gaze met the settlers, a silent question hanging heavily in the chilled air. The settler barely nodded, breath caught, as if daring fate to claim this moment. The wind shifted unexpectedly, stirring the scent of sage and smoke. The settler's mind raced. Had mercy become a trap? Could he hold the fragile truce in the face of mounting threats? His thoughts flicked to the wounded man he sought to save, the proud soul beneath broken skin and fading life. Suddenly, from the thicket near the cabin's side, a sudden clatter shattered the tense quiet. Heads snapped toward the noise. A young Apache messenger, eyes wide with urgency, burst forward, his chest heaving. They multiply. Riders come now from every ridge. The land burns where we once roamed free. The settlers and warriors froze. The weight of that warning pressing down like a stone. The ragged breaths of the injured man grew even shallower, as if the land itself echoed his fading strength. Before the settler could respond, the ranger's leader, a gaunt man with hawk eyes and a face carved by western winds, signaled sharply. Half a dozen riders dismounted, rifles raised, the barrels tipped with menace. Their boots crunched over cracked earth that seemed too dry to bear the promise of war. "Lay down your weapons," the leader called, voice slicing the cold. "The man is a fugitive. Surrender him, or face the consequences." The settler's jaw clenched. His gaze flicked to the Apache warriors who awaited his word. One by one, their grips tightened on tomahawks and rifles, faces set like carved stone. The fragile alliance they had formed, a shield woven from necessity and desperation, would soon be tested by fire. "We will not surrender him," the settler replied, voice steady despite the storm thrumming beneath his ribs. "He is under my protection." A muscle tensed in the leader's jaw as he stepped forward, the sun rising behind him like a half-forgotten promise. "You choose defiance, then. Know this, there are more coming. Rangers, militia, and forces that see no line between friend and foe. Mercy will not save you." A shadow flickered across the settler's face. Resolve hardening into steel. Perhaps not, but honor still breathes here. His eyes sought the fading life in the warrior's gaze, and in that fleeting moment, two souls spoke without words, bonded beyond borders. The wounded man's fingers twitched weakly, curling around the settler's roughened wrist, a silent benediction wrapped in pain. The settler's heart constricted, the fragile ember of hope flickering faintly. Outside, the thin line between dawn and full morning blurred as the harsh scent of smoke rolled over the plains. Flames licked the horizon with a ravenous hunger, swallowing dry grass and brittle sagebrush in their fiery maw. The land mourned beneath a sky thick with ash and sorrow. The Apache warriors exchanged grim looks, their ancient code whispering through their veins. The messenger, catching his breath, spoke again, voice strained. They carve the land with fire, not just our foes, but neighbors turned enemies. The frontier bleeds. The settler swallowed a rising tide of dread. This was more than a chase, a reckoning. It was a war for the soul of the land itself, and every man caught in its grasp could only choose where he stood when the firestorm came. He turned to the warriors who had chosen to stand with him, every scar and tattoo a testament to battles fought and lost. We are bound now, not by blood, but by the fire that seeks to consume us all. Their eyes held defiance, but beneath it, a fragile fear. Even the fiercest heart knew the weight of the flames drawing close. The leader of the Rangers spat a curse and barked orders. Horses pawed and stamped. Riders spurred to tighten their cordon. The settler closed his hands over the wounded man, the cloth now dark with fresh blood. A sudden piercing cry rent the air, a scream born from the far edge of the ranch. The horses reared instinctively, heads twisting to catch the sound. The settler's gaze shot toward the source, heart pounding. From the tree line, a young woman burst through, clothes torn and face streaked with dirt and tears. "They're here." "The militia sets fire to the eastern valley," she gasped, barely able to stand. The silence shattered, replaced by a rising roar of desperation. The Rangers sharpened their focus. The Apache warriors tightened ranks, and the settler felt the cold breath of inevitability brush his neck. "No more hiding," he whispered, voice raw but fierce. "Tonight the land chooses who will survive. And we will fight like the fire itself." As the smoke spiraled skyward into the waking dawn, he caught the faintest glimmer of movement beyond the ridge, a shadow darker than the rising sun, creeping closer with a promise of ruin. The wind carried a curse across the burning plains, and with it, the chilling certainty that the settler's choice had ignited a war far greater than any one man's mercy. From the swirling smoke, a lone figure emerged, unseen until now, watching, waiting, and holding a secret that could shatter the fragile alliance forever. The first light of dawn bled through the cracked windows, casting shards of pale gold onto the battered floorboards. The settlers' breaths came in shallow bursts, each one colder than the last, as he knelt beside the wounded Apache warrior. The ragged cloth, pressed against jagged flesh, was soaked dark with blood, a silent testament to the desperate gamble he had made through the long night. Outside, the circle of Apache warriors remained unmoving, their faces carved from stone, eyes sharp as flint, watching with the patience of storms. A sudden snap echoed from the ridge, a soft breaking twig that drew every eye like a flare in the dark. The settler's heart hammered violently against his ribs. He raised his gaze, catching the distant blaze of movement. where the rangers' mounts stirred restlessly. The sun's lazy ascent revealed the grim faces of men long hardened by frontier justice, hands steady on rifles that gleamed with cold intent. They waited for an answer the land dared not give. Inside the cabin, the wounded warrior's chest heaved unevenly, breath faltering beneath the weight of pain and pride. His eyes flickered open, burning embers, hinting at a defiance that even death had yet to claim. The settler met that fierce gaze, a silent exchange bridging the chasm of ages and enmity between them. In that fragile glance lay a whispered promise that mercy was no weakness, but the fiercest form of courage. Outside, the tallest Apache stepped forward, the lines of scars on his weathered face like hieroglyphs of battles etched deep in his soul. His voice broke the heavy silence, low and weighted with the honor of his people. "He carries the fire of our ancestors still," he said, eyes never leaving his fallen brother. "But the land chooses no favorites. If he dies, it will be with honor." The settler pressed the cloth tighter, fingers trembling as he fought to slow the cruelty seeping from the wound. "I will not let him go alone," he whispered, voice cracked with exhaustion and resolve. Not with the rangers waiting outside to claim him." A murmur rippled through the circle of warriors, words unspoken yet carried deeply in the shifting air. A delicate truce hung by a thread made taut by desperation and shared humanity. For a fleeting heartbeat, enemy and protector were bound by the same fragile breath. Then the heavy pounding of hooves ruptured the dawn's quiet like thunder, rolling through the endless plains. The rangers advanced, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun, rifles aimed like vultures' talons, ready to strike. The settler rose slowly, standing between the gathered warriors and the hostile dawn. Every muscle ached with the weight of impending violence. "We stand together," he declared, voice steady despite the coil of fear tightening inside. "No one will cross this threshold unnoticed. Not while I breathe." The Apache warriors shifted, weapons brought to ready. Their gaze swept the horizon, alert, unblinking, but their eyes returned to the settler, a shared resolve blazing fiercer than any gunpowder. Suddenly, a sharp cry cut through the morning air, wild and desperate. From the thickets bordering the homestead, a young woman stumbled in, dirt smeared across her cheeks and tears streaking the grime. Breathless, she gasped, "The militia burns the eastern valley. Men, women, children, fleeing the flames. They march with fire and fury, closer than we feared." The silence broke like fragile glass. The settler's gaze hardened, cold dread coiling tight as smoke curled against the sky, dark and unwelcome. The Apache warriors exchanged glances heavy with ancient sorrow and rising fury. Their homeland was bleeding, the battle roaring beyond the horizon, where scorched earth claimed the footprints of those who once claimed it free. The lead ranger's face twisted into a snarl. "No sanctuary here," he spat harshly. "This is frontier justice. The law rides hard, and mercy is a luxury for fools." The settler's eyes never wavered. And yet, here we are, bound by a choice none of us made, but all must live with. Stand down or join the flames. A tense beat passed. Then, a sudden rustling from the cabin's shadow drew every gaze. The wounded warrior stretched trembling fingers, brushing the settler's hand, a ghost of a grip, fierce in its fragility. His spirit fights still, the settler breathed, voice tight with unspent grief and stubborn hope. And so do we, all of us, for more than land, for survival, for honor still lost and yet not forgotten. The distant drumbeat of more hooves thundered down the valley, a growing tide of riders massed in dust and malign purpose. The settler swallowed the rising panic, feeling the fragile alliance buckle beneath the weight of coming war. But even as the land whispered smoke and fire, even as neighbor turned enemy beneath the bleeding sky, there was a spark, sharp and defiant, as two worlds held their breath above the tip of a knife. A shadow detached from the ridge, shifting slow and deliberate, watching from beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The mystery in those darkened eyes promised secrets that could break the fragile peace or forge it anew. The settler's gaze locked onto the figure, heart pounding like a war drum, knowing that the next choice would echo beyond the homestead and across the burning plains. The wind carried the scent of burning sage and fear. The settler's voice was barely a whisper as the figure stepped closer from the smoke. Everything changes with the rising sun. Tonight, the frontier's fate will be written in blood, and the lines we choose to cross. Silence fell heavy as the first tongues of flame licked the edges of the valley, and beneath the gathering storm, a single truth echoed. Mercy was a spark, but war was the wildfire it risked igniting. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, its pale light spilling reluctantly into the cold shadows that clung to the settler's cabin. The dozen Apache warriors remained statuesque, their presence a silent, unwavering ring of quiet authority. The wounded man lay fragile between them, each breath a fragile defiance against the inevitable. The settler's fingers trembled as they tightened their grip over the blood-soaked cloth, pressed to the jagged wound. His heart, a conflicted drumbeat of hope and dread. The sharp crack of a branch snapping nearby shattered the brittle calm. All eyes darted toward the source, tension rippling through the circle like an electric current. Dust stirred on the ridge where the distant thunder of hoofbeats grew louder. Riders approaching fast, their intent as cold and unforgiving as the steel gleaming in the dawn. The tallest Apache stepped forward, face carved with the lines of battles long survived, eyes dark pools of ancestral sorrow and resolve. His voice cut through the thickening silence, low and ancient. The fire that burns in him is not yet spent, but the time for mercy grows thin. He glanced at the settler, measuring the weight of the fragile truce forged in darkness. "What say you now, guardian of this wounded brother?" The settler drew a ragged breath, fingers steady, despite the storm thrumming beneath his skin. "He stays under my roof. No law nor war will claim him today." His voice, cracked with exhaustion and stubborn defiance, echoed off the rough-hewn walls, reverberating against the colliding wills gathered here. Murmurs ran like shadows among the warriors. Some looked away, others held their gaze, a language of glances that spoke beyond words. Suspicion, honor, the shared understanding of borders temporarily crossed. The elder warrior's gaze hardened. "If you shield him, you must stand with us," The hunters will not desist so easily. A distant roar answered before words could further bind the pact. Riders bearing down the valley, their shapes flickering amid the rising dust. The sun surged upward, exposing glints of rifle barrels and the grim faces of those who carried the frontier's harsh judgment. The settler squared his shoulders, each muscle coiled against the roaring tide closing in. He turned back to the dim forms swathed in shadows, the warrior, whose life balanced by a thread soaked in drying blood. The man's eyes opened briefly, fierce embers meeting the settler's steady gaze. A quiet benediction passed unspoken as shaking fingers closed weakly around the roughened wrist. From the edge of the homestead, a sudden scream tore through the fragile morning calm. The horses stamped. The ranger's eyes snapped, sharp, as a figure stumbled forward, a young woman, dirt-streaked, panic etched into every line. Breathless, she gasped the words that fell like kindling on dry grass. "They burn! The Eastern Valley burns! Smoke chokes the sky! Men and women run, caught in the flames of those who once called them neighbor." The circle of warriors exchanged glances, thick with ancient pain and burning fury. Their homeland bled beneath the cruel hunger of fire and gunpowder. The settler's heart tightened, the weight of that cry folding into his own aching resolve. Behind the mounted men, their leader's voice rang out sharp and cold. "No sanctuary here. The law rides hard, and mercy is a luxury for fools." The settler's voice steadied into a leaden steel. "Then we stand where mercy dares to linger. Here, beneath this roof, we draw the line. Between vengeance and honor." Sparks of defiance flickered in the warrior's eyes, fists gripping tomahawks and rifles, poised between battle and parley. The rangers shifted their stance, weapons raising to claim what they deemed theirs. The land seemed to pause, waiting for the inevitable breaking point. A whisper of movement from within the cabin shifted the tide. Weak fingers stretched, brushing the settler's rough palm in a tremulous grip. A dying fire's last flicker, a testament that even battered proud souls can still kindle hope. From beyond the ridge, more shadows spilled forward. Riders masked in dust and hard intent, swelling like a rising flood. The settler swallowed the tightening choke of panic, clinging to the fragile alliance born across lines, written in blood and desperation. Through the smoky veil whispered a voice, the shadow at the edge of the homestead, slipping forward into the breaking light. Dark eyes gleamed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, a presence both watchful and weighing. The settler's breath hitched as the figure spoke, voice low and heavy as the land itself. "Fire comes not just from guns, but from choices made in smoke and silence. Tonight, that flame will decide who is saved, who is lost." The circle tightened. The scent of burning sage and dry grass swirled in the air, thick and suffocating. The wounded warrior coughed, blood-spattered lips parting slightly, his fierce spirit flickering between life and oblivion. The settler met his gaze, a silent vow passed between them, stitched from threads of mercy and stubborn will to survive. The morning bled fully into day as the first tongues of flame curled upward beyond the horizon, setting the plains alight with furious hunger. The settler's fingers clenched around the bloodied cloth, tighter still, his voice a whispered pledge to those gathered, standing as one on the fragile edge of survival. But from the gathering smoke, a new silhouette emerged. An enemy or an unlikely harbinger, eyes glinting with secrets that threatened to unravel the delicate thread holding this fragile peace. The settler's gaze locked on the figure, heart pounding with cold certainty. As the firestorm roared nearer, the truth burned brighter than the flames. Mercy was but a spark, and the wildfire it threatened to ignite could consume friend and foe alike. The silence shattered with a single, haunting whisper carried on the wind. They come with steel and fire, but it is what lies within the shadows that will decide the fate of all. Dawn lingered on the edge of the horizon, pale and hesitant, as the settler's cabin braced under the weight of gathering shadows. Outside, the dozen Apache warriors formed an unyielding circle, faces carved from lifetimes of pain and resolve, their silence a pressure as tangible as the blood seeping through the torn cloth at the wounded man's side. The settler knelt close, heart drumming a reckless rhythm, every breath he took a delicate balance between hope and dread. The heavy quiet shattered as a twig snapped sharply near the ridge. All eyes turned, muscles tensed like drawn bows. The distant thunder of hooves edged closer, each pounding beat against dry earth, a grim herald. The rangers, cold and relentless, approached with rifles poised, their shadows growing long and dark by the rising sun. The tallest Apache, his scarred face an atlas of battles endured, stepped forward. His eyes met the settlers', weight heavy with unspoken understanding. "The fire within him fades," the warrior said, voice low as the wind over the plains. "But honor seeks its due. What have you to offer to those who come with judgment in their hands?" The settler's fingers tightened over the bloodied cloth, fighting the bitter seep of crimson. "The man lives under my protection. I choose mercy, not for weakness, but for a justice deeper than revenge." His voice bore the grit of hard roads traveled and courage hard earned. Among the silent circle, eyes flickered, some shadowed with doubt, others with a flicker of fragile hope. The elder nodded slowly. "If you guard his life, you carry the burden we share. Watch well. The hunters will not cease their chase." A sudden cry tore through the air, a desperate, ragged scream from the tree line. Horses stamped wildly in response. The ranger's eyes narrowed. Like hawks, from the edge of the homestead, a young woman, dirt-streaked and trembling, stumbled forward. "The Eastern Valley burns," she gasped, clutching the settler's arm. "Militia rides with fire and fury. Men, women, children fleeing the flames. They come closer than ever." The news hung between them like acrid smoke. Faces hardened, hands clenched weapons anew. The frontier was bleeding beneath a cruel and ravenous tide. The leader of the rangers spat on the dusty earth. "There is no mercy here. The law rides through blood and flame. Surrender the fugitive, or be swept away by both." The settler's eyes burned with steadfast resolve. "No hand but mine will claim him. Here, beneath this roof, mercy holds fast against the storm." The Apache warriors exhaled as one, tightening their grip on tomahawks and rifles, standing shoulder to shoulder in defiance. The fragile truce they forged in darkness pulsed alive, a breath held against the coming tempest. Inside, the wounded man's fingers fluttered weakly, closing around the settler's rough palm with a trembling strength that stirred the tired soul beside him. His eyes, fierce embers flickering despite the pain, spoke silent oath and shared survival. The thundering hooves rolled closer, thickening the air with dust and menace. A cloud of riders began to crest the distant ridge, swelling like a gathering storm. The settlers swallowed the tightening knot of fear, the fragile alliance pressing against the edge of ruin. From the shroud of morning smoke, a lone figure detached, stepping forward with quiet menace beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Dark eyes glinted with secrets sharpened by hard choices, watchful and waiting. The settler's breath hitched as the figure's voice lowered to a somber cadence. The fire that threatens these plains is born not just of flame and steel, but of shadows cast long by broken oaths. Tonight, the frontier's fate will be written in blood, and the lines one chooses to cross. A hush settled, heavier than the burning air. The scent of scorched sage wound through the gathering storm. The wounded warrior coughed, blood-spattered lips parting in a fragile plea. The settler pressed closer, voice hoarse, yet unwavering, even as the land tears and falls. Mercy remains a light, fierce enough to challenge the dark. The horizon glowed ominous. Flames licked hungrily at the dry grass beyond the ridge, an inferno hungry for all that stood in its path. The settler clenched the bloodied cloth tighter, feeling the heavy weight of the choices to come. In that moment, as the fires advanced and the rangers raised their weapons, the settler's gaze locked onto the shadowed stranger. A single truth seethed beneath the smoky dawn. Mercy could start a spark, but the wildfire it risked unleashing would consume friend, foe, and all that lay between. The figure stepped forward into the fading mist, and with a voice like a deadly promise whispered, "They come not as neighbors now, but as flames that will burn the past to ash and those who stand in their path." The settler's breath caught, heart pounding in the heavy silence that swallowed the land. The war before them was no longer just of men or tribes. It was a reckoning, burning beyond control, poised to swallow everything in its path. And with that, the distant sky cracked open, an unearthly scream slicing the air, as a new force, neither settler nor warrior, descended into the valley's heart. Dawn crept. Over the horizon, like a slow-burning fuse, casting a pale gray light over the homestead. The settler stood frozen, his breath caught between hope and dread, as the dozen Apache warriors emerged silently from the shadows. Their eyes cold yet unreadable, trained on the battered figure cradled inside the cabin. The jagged wound that bled, dark and slow, was a silent testament to the dangerous game being played in this fragile refuge. The tallest warrior stepped forward, the deep lines on his scarred face etching a history of pain, endurance, and a fierce code of honor. His gaze pierced the settler's soul, without anger, only the heavy weight of inevitability. "He carries the fire of our ancestors," he said quietly, voice low as the wind rustling the sagebrush. "But the earth will claim him soon. We only seek to honor what remains." The settler pressed the worn cloth tighter against the wound, his hands trembling with exhaustion and the relentless pounding of fear. "He stays under my roof," he said, voice rough as gravel but steady. "I will not surrender him to death, nor to those who seek only vengeance." The circle of warriors tightened, eyes flickering between silent acknowledgement and the sharp edge of doubt. Outside, the whisper of shifting wind carried the faint sound of hoofbeats. Growing louder, faster, the settler's heart hammered as dust swirled against the ridge, a dark shape rapidly approaching. The dreaded Rangers, a force of cold certainty and merciless law, were closing in with guns drawn and justice sharpened to a lethal edge. With breath shallow and ragged, the wounded man's eyes fluttered open, fierce embers glowing faintly through pain's veil. His fingers, weak and trembling, sought out the settler's wrist, closing briefly in a silent gesture of trust forged in blood and desperation. Between them hung a fragile pact, unspoken yet profound, a tether woven from necessity, mercy, and a shared yearning for something beyond the endless cycle of violence. Suddenly, from the thicket lining the edge of the homestead, a sharp crack pierced the morning stillness. The warriors snapped alert, weapons raised in unison as the settler's gaze shot toward the noise. Emerging from tangled brush, a young Apache courier staggered forward, eyes wide with urgency and dread. "They come, riders from every ridge, more than before," he gasped, voice raw. "The land is aflame, and the fire spreads fast." The settlers and warriors exchanged grim looks, the bitter truth sinking like lead. The war that had once been distant now bore down with merciless claws. The horizon choked with smoke and ash. The fragile truce in the cabin trembled on the brink of ruin beneath the weight of looming annihilation. From the crest of the ridge came the sharp command of the Rangers' leader, a gaunt man whose cold eyes flickered with lethal calculation. "Lay down your arms, surrender the fugitive, or prepare for the consequences." His voice cut through the tension like a whip. The settler straightened, eyes blazing with a fierce defiance, born of equal parts exhaustion and unyielding conviction. "He is under my protection. Not today, not here." A muscle twitched in the leader's jaw, lips curling with disdain. "Then you choose defiance. Know this, there are many more coming. The frontier's law is swift and unforgiving." The Apache warriors drew their weapons tight, faces forged in silent resolve. The settler's jaw clenched against the cold surge of adrenaline, knowing that mercy had summoned a storm far greater than pain or pursuit. A piercing scream shattered the fragile standoff, wild and desperate, echoing from the far side of the ranch. Horses reared and stamped, nostrils flaring against the acrid scent of burning sage. A young woman, tear-streaked and battered, burst through the tree line, clutching the settler's arm. "They're here, the militia! The eastern valley is ablaze. Smoke chokes the sky, and people run from the flames." The settler's breath hitched, the weight of hopelessness and fury crashing against the fragile hope nestled in his chest. The leaders of the warriors exchanged haunted glances, ancestors' battles whispered in their eyes, binding them to a land bleeding beneath relentless fire and hatred. The tension twisted razor-sharp as the Rangers advanced, rifles leveled with merciless intent. The settlers stepped between them, and the wounded man, arms wide in defiance, "We stand together." A faint movement stirred within the cabin as the wounded warrior's fingers clenched weakly around the settler's calloused hand. A silent vow wrapped in agony and unbroken spirit. The battle between survival and surrender played out in that fragile grasp, a testament that mercy could yet kindle a flame against engulfing darkness. The thunder of hooves swelled, a tide of grim riders spilling over the ridge like a gathering tempest. The settler swallowed a tightening knot of fear, but held firm. The alliance of enemy and protector, fused by desperation and stubborn heart. Emerging like a shadow from the smoke, rose a figure, features concealed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, dipped low over sharp eyes that gleamed with secrets. The presence was a riddle carved from the rough frontier, watching and weighing the fragile line between peace and war. The settler's breath caught, the pulse of impending fate thrumming deep and loud. "The fire spreads," the figure murmured, voice low but sharp. "Not just in flame, but in blood and broken promises. Tonight, the land will reckon, and those who choose their side will be scorched beyond forgetting." The settler's gaze locked onto the stranger, heart pounding within a chest clenched tight as dry earth. Behind them, the horizon overflowed with smoke and the hungry jaws of fire creeping ever closer. The fragile thread of mercy trembled in the heat, and in that tense pause before the inevitable, the settler knew this. Mercy had ignited a spark, but the wildfire it threatened to unleash would consume all, friend, foe, and the soul of the land itself. From the drifting smoke, a single chilling whisper clawed through the morning air. "They come, not as neighbors, but as flames, hungry to burn the past away, and anyone foolish enough to stand in their path." Dawn struggled to break fully over the horizon, casting a trembling light on the rugged cabin and the circle of shadowed figures that encased it like a fortress of brittle resolve. The settler's breath hitched in his throat, every heartbeat a hammer striking an uncertain rhythm as the Apache warriors tightened their silent vigil. Inside, the wounded man's shallow gasps wove a frail thread of life between pounding danger and desperate hope. The distant rumble of hooves grew louder, a grim drum summoning the inevitable. The settler's gaze flicked between the stoic warriors and the trembling, ragged form he had chosen to shelter beneath the scant protection of his roof and law. His hands, slick with sweat and stained dark by blood, clutched the torn cloth still pressed against the jagged wound. Every second stretched, taut with peril. The tallest Apache stepped forward, his scarred eyes cold as flint, yet carrying a shadow of sorrow deeper than words. "The fire in his chest wanes," he said, voice low and solemn, "yet honor binds us. The hunters will not relent. What will be your stand when the storm breaks?" The settler swallowed the surge of fear rising like a bitter tide, but did not falter. "He remains here, under my watch until the land claims him or the dawn comes full." His voice was ragged, yet steady, hammered by sleepless nights and a heart weighed heavy by mercy's cost. A low murmur spiraled through the circle as warriors exchanged glances laden with ancient pain and hard wisdom. Their silent communion spoke of choices etched in blood and smoke, the thin, fragile bonds that tethered enemies when survival demanded uneasy alliances. Suddenly, a sharp crack shattered the tense lull, the snap of a twig at the edge of the ridge. Every muscle tightened like steel wire. The dust blossomed into clouds as riders surged forward, the unmistakable silhouettes of rangers looming against the awakening light. Their eyes gleamed with merciless resolve. Rifles raised, promises of ruin clenched in calloused hands. From the cabin threshold, the settler squared his shoulders, muscles coiled and nerves humming with raw defiance. "They will not have him," he declared, voice clear and unyielding. "This is my land, my honor. No man rides through these gates unchallenged." The warriors shifted, grasping weapons worn by battles long past, faces carved by years of grief and unbroken will. Their fierce silence roared louder than any gunshot, a shield forged of sweat and blood. Within the cabin, the wounded Apache's eyes flickered, fiery embers burning beneath the veil of pain. His trembling hand reached weakly, fingers curling around the settler's wrist, a silent testament that even in agony, pride remained unbowed. The settler's chest tightened, a knot of wild hope and deep sorrow. A piercing scream, ragged and raw, tore through the morning calm. The horses reared, nostrils flaring as tension snapped taut. From the tree line burst a young woman, dirt streaked across her face and tears streaking the grime. Breathless, she gasped, "They're burning the Eastern Valley. The militia rages with fire and steel. The smoke chokes the sky, and people scatter, desperate and afraid. They come closer, too close." The devastating truth shuddered through. The circle like a death knell. Faces hardened, grips over weapons constricted anew. The land itself seemed to recoil beneath the weight of relentless flames, consuming all they had once called home. The Rangers' leader spat on dry earth, voice a dagger slicing the tense air. "No sanctuary for fugitives. Surrender him or face the law's full reckoning." The settler's gaze did not waver. "Then we stand, together. Under this roof, mercy still breathes, even if the world burns." The Apache warriors raise their tomahawks, rifles steady and eyes fierce, a testament to a fragile unity born from desperation and hardened hearts. The Rangers shifted, their weapons aimed with bone-cold precision, poised at the edge of violence. Inside the cabin, the wounded man's grip tightened weakly, a whispered pledge forged in pain and unspoken understanding. The settler's heart clenched, the ember of hope flickering amid the encroaching shadows. The thunderous hooves of the approaching reinforcements rolled like a gathering storm. New riders cresting the ridge, dust cloaking their advance like a shroud. Anxiety tangled with resolve as the fragile alliance braced against the rising tide. From the haze emerged a lone figure, silhouette dark beneath a wide-brimmed hat, eyes sharp and secretive. The settler's breath caught as the stranger stepped closer, voice low and weighty. The fire that devours the plains is born as much from old wounds as from new flames. Tonight, both will rage, and the lines drawn in ash will decide who endures. Smoke curled thickly in the rising sun, carrying the acrid promise of destruction. The settler met the shadowed gaze, heart hammering against a chest, tight with dread and defiance. Mercy, once a fragile spark, now threatened to ignite a wildfire, consuming all, friend, foe, and the very soul of the land. A sudden rattling crack sounded beyond the ridge, a blinding flare of flame roaring skyward, and from the choking smoke, a voice hissed like a curse on the wind. They come not as neighbors, but as ashes, ready to burn everything that stands. The settler's eyes never wavered from the stranger. Beneath the choking sky, with the land aflame, and the rangers tightening their noose, the fragile hope now stood at the precipice of ruin. And as the firestorm's hungry roar swallowed the morning, the settler whispered to the gathering storm, "The frontier will burn, but the fight to save what remains begins here." From the veil of smoke and ash, something unseen shifted, a presence waiting, watching, holding a secret that could either forge salvation or shatter the fragile thread of mercy forever. Dawn's first light filtered softly through the cracked windows, bathing the cabin in a pale, fragile glow. Outside, the air was heavy with silence, the tension coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. The settler knelt beside the wounded Apache warrior, his hands steady but worn with exhaustion as he pressed fresh cloth against the ragged gash staining the man's side. Each breath the warrior drew was shallow, a weakening ember of life, flickering against the unyielding grasp of death. The circle of Apache warriors stood guard around the homestead, faces set like weather-worn stone, eyes clouded with sorrow and fierce determination. Their presence was both shield and storm, silent witnesses to the fragile truce held beneath the settler's roof. From the ridge, the pounding of hooves grew louder, a grim drumbeat signaling the inevitable arrival of the Rangers. Their silhouettes dark against the rising sun cast long shadows of judgment and violence. The settler's gaze shifted toward the approaching riders, then fell again on the fading warrior beside him. For a fleeting moment, their eyes locked, pride and gratitude mingling in a silent exchange that transcended the bitter divides of blood and history. The man's trembling fingers closed weakly around the settler's wrist, a fragile benediction whispered without words. A sharp crack suddenly rang out, a twig snapped beneath heavy boot, and the settler's breath hitched. The Rangers pressed closer, rifles leveled, their menace unmistakable. The leader, a gaunt man with hawk-like eyes, called out, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Surrender the fugitive. End this now." The settler rose slowly, standing firm between the men and the battered figure whose life hung by the thinnest of threads. "He is under my protection," he said, voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "Not today. Not here." The Apache warriors shifted, hands tightening on tomahawks and rifles, their silent oath now sealed by a shared resolve. The leader's lips curled with thin disdain. "Then prepare to face the consequences. Reinforcements ride hard, and mercy will not save you from justice." Before the Rangers could advance, a cry shattered the tense stillness. A wild, desperate scream from the far edge of the property. Horses reared, nostrils flaring against the acrid scent of smoke curling over the plains. A young woman burst through the trees, her face streaked with dirt and tears, breath ragged with urgency. "The militia burns the eastern valley," she gasped. "Homes, fields, men, women, children fleeing the fire. The fight is closer than we ever feared." The news struck like a hammer blow. The gathered warriors exchanged silent glances, ancient grief and fiery wrath flickering in their eyes. The land itself seemed to mourn beneath a sky veiled in thickening smoke. The settlers' chest tightened as the weight of despair pressed down, but beneath it, a stubborn ember of defiance kindled anew. The Rangers tightened their grip on rifles, stepping forward with cold precision, but the settler held his ground. "We will stand against this fire, together." Within the cabin, the wounded man's eyes fluttered weakly open. Despite agony etched deep into his features, a fierce light burned in his gaze. His trembling hand searched out the settlers, fingers grasping once more, a silent testament to the bond forged in shared hardship and mercy. Outside, the distant thunder of more hooves approached, a swelling tide of riders moving. Swiftly, dust swirling like ghostly banners above the parched earth. The settler swallowed hard, senses sharpened by the gravity of the coming battle. The fragile alliance had been tested and now stood unbroken, ready to face the storm. From a smoky haze rose a lone figure, stepping forward beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Eyes dark and unreadable, the stranger's presence carried the weight of gravely guarded secrets, watching, waiting for choice and consequence. The settler met that gaze, heart heavy yet unbowed. "The fires burning will not just consume the land," the figure spoke softly, voice carrying the cold certainty of the frontier. "They will burn through trust and blood alike. Tonight, the fate of this place will be sealed in flame and steel." The settler squared his shoulders, eyes flicking to the battered warrior, the warrior whose life he had gambled to save. The man's breath was shallow now, but his spirit burned fierce as ever. Around him, the Apache warriors stood firm, their ancient honor echoing in every measured breath. Smoke billowed higher, dark tongues snaking toward the waking sky. The distant crackle of fire reached the ears of all, a grim soundtrack to the reckoning that loomed close. The settler's voice fell low, a vow wrapped in quiet strength. Mercy was the spark that lit this fuse. But it will also be our shield. We will fight, not just for one life, but for the hope that still flickers in the heart of this land. A sudden wind swept through the homestead, scattering ashes and stirring resolve. The young woman's eyes met the settlers, reflecting fierce determination, born of loss and grit. The warriors exchanged a nod, a silent pact, unbreakable, even in the gathering storm. The riders crested the ridge, faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats, guns drawn and ready. But the settler stood tall between them and the cabin, the quiet guardian of a fragile, precious hope. As the first flames licked the edges of the distant valley, as smoke darkened the morning light, the settler looked once more to the warrior, to the circle of Apache warriors, and whispered, "No matter the fire outside, here we decide what legacy will burn and what will endure." The warrior's fingers squeezed his wrist softly, a last fierce defiance, and then closed, still as the land falling silent beneath the weight of dawn. And amid smoke, ash, and the promise of battle, a new day waited, shaped not by division and rage, but by the courage to stand together on the unforgiving edge of the frontier.